Jordan B. Peterson, the most glorified and vilified psychologist in the world. If you've heard his name, you're more than likely in one of two camps. Number one, you might see him as a wonderful psychologist, an intellectual bravely facing down the political correctness movement and the postmodernist neo-Marxist radical left. Or number two, you might see him as a radical right-wing political religious nut with misogynistic and hate-filled fascist views, every dumb person, smart person, and hero in the incels. If you're in either one of those two camps, I'm going to disappoint you. Today, we're going to stay away from politics. In fact, so much so that if I ever start to veer off course and start talking about the politics, this is what you're going to hear. And that's going to remind me to stay talking about what I know, which is psychology. And so we're going to be looking at the psychological aspects of his work. In this first of a two-part series, we're going to be diving into the first book that Dr. Peterson wrote, which is called Maps of Meaning. And once again, I'm going to give you my perspective in terms of the ideas in there. And the truth is, Jordan Peterson is complicated. While it's easy to attack him or defend him and glorify him with blanket statements, I'm really interested in seeing what he has to say that's useful. And so welcome to this brand new part of the Work of series. This is going to be a doozy. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Change Minds podcast. My name is Owen Fitzpatrick, and thank you for joining me on this very fun episode where it's going to be the first of two parts. And in this particular part, we're going to be diving into one of Jordan B. Peterson's books known as Maps of Meaning. This is, as you can see, it's a big, heavy book, right? It's extremely good. If you don't like someone, you want to hit them over the head. This really carries a lot of weight. Let me tell you, this hurts if it falls on you. It is heavy, but there's some really good ideas in there. A lot of words, and I mean a lot of words. If you like the dictionary, you're gonna love this book. But I will say that I wanna identify in it some of the most important psychological ideas in there so that hopefully we can learn something about how we can change the way in which we think. The subtitle of the book is actually called The Architecture of Belief. And as many of you know, if you've seen me before, which hopefully you have, I am all about belief. I've been working and developing a field called belief leadership, and I want to investigate Peterson's way of thinking about beliefs as well. Now, before we get into Jordan B. Peterson and before we get into Maps of Meaning, let's draw attention to the elephant in the room, shall we say. I'm wearing glasses. You're asking yourself the question, how can you be even sexier with glasses as you are without glasses? Like, it just makes no sense to me. And I get it. I understand it. But I'm wearing glasses not because of the sex appeal, but I'm wearing glasses because I need them, unfortunately, now to read certain things on screens. And since I have lots of notes about Maps of Meaning, I want to make sure I'm able to read them. So therein lies the rub. Anyway, let's get into Jordan B. Peterson. Who is he? And we're going to be very careful because I could easily just veer off into the political minefield that is Jordan's perspectives politically. I'm going to avoid them at all costs, and I'm going to do my very best not to trigger that buzzer that we talked about a few moments ago. So Jordan B. Peterson is a Canadian psychologist. He initially became popular for his YouTube videos where he talked about mythology, religion, psychology, and philosophy. And a lot of the lectures were his lectures on Maps of Meaning back in Harvard in the 90s, and then he continued to lecture on those kind of concepts, those kind of ideas. In 2012, he responded to a question on Quora. The question went something like, what are the most valuable things everyone should know? And he wrote a series of 40 different principles or ideas or suggestions for people. Those 40 points soon became very popular at the time. And those 40 principles were sort of reduced down to the 24 principles in his two other books, which are called The 12 Rules for Life and Beyond Order, which we'll be talking about in part 2 of this two-parter. But Peterson rose to fame in a very radical way, if you'll excuse the pun, in 2016 when a new proposed law in Canada called Bill C-16, looks like I'm not allowed to say that either. Okay, let me try that again just in case that was a mistake. Bill C-16. Okay, anyway, it was pretty controversial, his reaction to it. It got a lot of people very angry. A lot of people came to his defense, and suffice it to say, it catapulted him into the spotlight. From there on in, he was interviewed by Joe Rogan. You can't just buzz because I say Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan is not a reason to do that. Okay, come on, Joe's a lot of really good interviews. Okay, Joe Rogan. Okay, see, you can learn. So he was interviewed on Joe Rogan. And as a result of that, he became even more popular. He then continued to soar, did a lot of lecture tours. It made a lot of people realize just how much people needed to hear a lot of the things that he was talking about. And he, once again, 2017, 2018, 2019, became extremely popular, had some health issues, health problems over the course of around 2019, 2020 or so, and now is recovered from them and is on his newest book tour as we talk today, called Why We Wrestle with God, which is also the name of his new book, which we won't be doing a series on yet, at least. So let's get into the maps of meaning, the architecture of belief, again, written by Jordan B. Peterson in 1999. He really looks at the structure of belief systems. And when he talks about belief systems, it's not just belief systems like I would talk about beliefs, which is ideas that we feel certainty about. The beliefs that he talks about are a little bit more with a, let's just say, religious connotation, okay? The beliefs that underlie the way in which we conceptualize the world. And they're not exclusively religious, but they do have that kind of element to them as he discusses them. He draws from areas like psychology, anthropology, history, religion, a lot of mythology to be able to explain really how myths and stories are involved in cultivating the kind of beliefs that we have and how they shape human behavior and societal structures. He talks about the past myths and religious stories and how vital they are in our ability to be able to function in the world. So we'll start, and the way I like to do things, I want to make sure that I'm breaking it down chapter by chapter and explaining it to you. So initially in the preface, he talks about his sort of journey to the work that he's been studying and why he became a psychologist in the first place. And he talks about when he went through confirmation classes, he argued because he felt that the logical basis for scripture, so whenever the religious teachers or whatnot would share with him the stories from the Bible or whatnot, he was skeptical and he was like, well, you don't have logical basis of that. And I think a lot of people go through that sort of phase. And he sort of was disillusioned with Christianity as a result of that. And then he got into college, and very early on in college, he became a socialist. And he was a socialist in university where it was all about, eradicate economic inequality. It's wrong. We don't like the way society is run. He was complaining against the status quo and was very frustrated with that. And he said that a book he read by George Orwell, not 1984, believe it or not, but The Road to Wigan Pier. It was a popular enough book. Obviously, George Orwell is the man. And in 1937, it was written. But this had a profound impact on Peterson because Peterson said after that, he realized that socialism, from his perspective, was more about hating the rich rather than loving the poor. And that was what made him disillusioned with socialism. And he thought that neither of them really explained evil. And he became fascinated with evil, the nature of evil. Why do people do what they do? And he felt that the ideology, for example, of socialism divided the world up too simplistically into those who thought and acted in one way versus another. So ideology itself, the notion of ideology, and ideology is really having a particular model of the world, a way in which you think that the world works. Oftentimes that can divide you into you're in one tribe and everyone else is in a different tribe. And we're going to talk a lot about ideology, let me tell you that. So we will get more into it. But in terms of the nature of evil, what he talked about was he looked at World War II and the Cold War and some of the incredibly terrible atrocities that were created by like nut jobs like Hitler and Stalin and how they murdered so many millions of people. And he wanted to understand, how does evil happen, and try to get to grips with it. And he remembers or recounts in the preface visiting a prison where he met a person who was very nice and polite to him, but he soon found out after that experience that this person had forced two policemen to dig their own graves and then shot them, right, after they dug their graves. So quite a dark story. But it made Peterson then start to imagine, could he Could he do evil things himself? Could he commit violent acts? And he imagined if he was in certain circumstances, would it be possible? And it scared him to think that, yes, indeed, he could. He had crazy dreams at the time, like I think he had one about Jesus Christ with a cobra wrapped around his waist. But he really started to be very much influenced by these dreams and nightmares, really, which made him interested in the work of Carl Jung. Now, Carl Jung was the student and colleague of Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud, of course, we know is the father of psychoanalysis. And it's like, you need to go back and find out why you liked your mother so much and why you hated your father, the whole Oedipus complex thing. Obviously, a lot more depth to Freud. But Carl Jung had a slightly more mythological, slightly more spiritual way of thinking about what he called the collective unconscious and notions like that. But Peterson became a fan of Carl Jung, studied his stuff, moved over away from politics. Well, at least in university, he moved away from politics. Okay, all right, okay, I'm sorry. So he anyway started studying psychology, and he wanted to know how do beliefs drive human behavior to both constructive as well as destructive ends. He studied myth to understand why evil exists and how can we fight it. And this is really what he explores in Maps of Meaning. A great quote that comes from the book, comes from this particular area, is the purpose of life, as far as I can tell, is to find a mode of being that's so meaningful that the fact of life is suffering is no longer relevant. So similar to the notion of a lot of religions, like for example, Buddhism, the first of the noble truths, life is suffering. This notion of life is suffering, I don't disagree with. I mean, I think life is suffering. Everything you get attached to, you lose in the end. There's a lot of suffering involved in life. And if you've a predilection for depression or anxiety or anything like that, well, it's even more suffering. If you're born in poor circumstances, it's even more suffering. So life is pretty heavy. And what he's saying here is the purpose of life is to find a mode of being that's so meaningful. And again, if you've heard something similar to this is from logotherapy. Viktor Frankl, the wonderful book, Man's Search for Meaning, where when he went through the horrible experiences of a concentration camp, Viktor was able to identify and find meaning in those experiences, find meaning in the suffering. And this is not a million miles away from what Peterson is saying here. So that definitely hits the button. So in the first chapter, it's called Maps of Experience, Object and Meaning. Well, he first says that in order to understand the world, we need to realize that the world is made up of two components. It's the things that we know and the things that we don't, the known and the unknown. And this is an important sort of beginning piece. These are sort of the foundations for his theory. He said our brains are designed to navigate this division between the known and the unknown with belief systems that provide us with maps that allow us to be able to guide ourselves through the unknown. And as we guide ourselves through the unknown, again, this is the big picture, the more we guide ourselves through the unknown, the more we make it known. So when we explore the world, we start to bring back insights about how it works, and that enriches and enlarges our maps of meaning. Maps are constructed from the shared stories and myths that have evolved over time. This is another important point. So Peterson's sort of saying that a lot of the stories and myths that we've been told from the beginning of time, and a lot of these are religious stories and other sort of stories, these are the very things that have helped shape our map. We are influenced by the many stories that we've heard, the many myths that have been around since the beginning of civilization, and that's very much influencing us. Peterson then distinguishes between two types of worlds. He said there's a world of things and a world of action, right? So the world of things is the objective reality around us. And then the world of action is more a world where our values, emotions, and beliefs, which drive what we do. So just having the facts of the case, just having an objective reality, doesn't actually allow us to be able to conceptualize what that means. The meaning comes from a different type of world. And that world is driven with trying to figure out what is the action we need to take, what is the right thing to do. And Peterson would argue that scientific progress caused a lot of spiritual distress. So as good as science has been, it doesn't answer all the questions, and it certainly doesn't give us the meaning that we're looking for in order for us to know what to do. So to understand human experience, he argues, we need to do two things. We need to understand science, but we also need to understand mythology. And he says that meaning is something that we can only derive from our experiences through this sort of process. He says that there's objects in reality, but there's also what he calls valence. Now, valence is a psychological term describing feeling positive or feeling quite negative. that is sort of the value that we give to that particular feeling at any moment in time. That's not something we get from the objective world. So in a nutshell, to summarize all of this, science isn't enough for us to understand the world. From Peterson's perspective, we need something else. We need to be able to find meaning, and our brain needs to be able to extract meaning from the experiences that we have. And that, he believes, comes from the notion of myth. To give a quote from him, "The world can be validly construed as a forum for action as well as a place of things. We describe the world as a place of things using the formal methods of science. The techniques of narrative, however, myth, literature, and drama portray the world as a forum for action." In other words, we can understand what's going on in the world through science, but in order for us to know what to do, the right thing, the best thing to do, that's where we use narrative and myth. So in chapter 2, he goes into what he calls maps of meaning. 3 kinds of levels of analysis, and he goes deeper into this. Now, remember, the size of this book is huge, right? So every chapter, he's going on a lot of different examples. He's like diving deep, right? He's even using some sort of diagrams every now and then. I mean, this guy goes in deep. This is not for the faint-hearted, let me say. It's well written. There's a lot of nice phrasing in it as well, and a lot of big words, But the reality is he dives deeper into 3 levels of analysis. The first is what he calls the mythological level, the pre-scientific level, where ancient myths and stories encapsulate human experiences and wisdom. So it sort of explains the mysteries of the world through these myths. Then the scientific level is how modern science attempts to objectively describe the world and our place in it. And this is sort of not really looking at the ethical guidelines or how we should behave. It's more about this is what the world is like. And then he said there's a final level called the phenomenological level. This is more about our individual subjective experience of the world, which is influenced by both. So it's influenced by science and it's influenced by mythology. And we need to be able to have a balance of both so that we can learn from both and use both and leverage both as effectively as possible. Now, Peterson does go into a bit of the neuroscience. He talks about the right brain and the left brain. The right deals with uncertainty and associates more with the limbic system. The left brain is more about putting it into language and articulating it. He talks about the brainstem and the amygdala and gives the old school sort of version that brainstem where the initial first part of the brain came, and then there was the emotional brain, and then there was the frontal cortex and whatnot. That's a little all over the place in terms of as a theory. Lisa Feldman Barrett, as many of you will know if you've heard me before, someone that I massive amount of respect for and spent a lot of time looking at her work. She's pretty much debunked this notion that we started out with a small sort of initial instinctive brain, and then we grew the emotional brain, and then we grew the frontal cortex, if you will. So it's not as simple as it's made out to be. But if we look at the rest of that chapter and we look at the notion of mythology and science, it's an interesting notion that the stories that have come beforehand inform the behaviors or actions we need to take. And science doesn't really give us a sense as to what the right thing to do is. And Peterson's sort of arguing, well, we need both. So interested to see where this goes and see how it might be useful for us. So in chapter 3 then, we get into apprenticeship and enculturation. And this is where he talks about how we adopt a shared map. This is how we learn the maps that we learn. And so how we learn the way of the world, he said, individuals learn and adopt collective belief system. These are like the norms or the values of our culture. What's the right thing to do? What's the wrong thing to do? It's the rise of socialization, education, and ritual in transferring these maps of meaning from one generation to the next. And all you have to do is look at when I went to Afghanistan, when I went to North Korea, when I went to Pakistan, when I went to Iran, wherever I've been, to all these countries, I met some incredibly wonderful people. But they're living in a very, very different world in a very, very different way than a lot of people in the Western world, in America and whatnot. And having traveled to just over 100 countries today, I've seen a lot of different collective maps of meaning that are very, very different. Different perspectives, different opinions about things. And even living in America, you obviously have, I was once asked by someone after I came back from North Korea, someone said, oh my goodness, the propaganda you must have experienced there must have been insane. And I said, yeah, but coming to the States, it's like in North Korea, they seem to have one perspective. In America, you got two. The person was like, it's kind of true. I mean, don't get me wrong, we have a lot of nuance. If you're having everyday conversations, a lot of the people that I actually talk to in real life have a much more nuanced perspective than the one that is presented to us in the media and social media. But oftentimes there's two ways of looking at everything. It's constantly polarizing. And that polarization is really two forms of culturalization, two forms of socialization, two forms of education that attempts to be able to position us and thinking about the way things should be. So this is happening here in the States. This is happening in lots of countries around the world, and we need to be able to recognize it. The adoption of a shared map through this sort of apprenticeship, through this enculturation, is crucial for social cohesion and individual psychological stability. So we need to learn a way to work. Otherwise, it's chaos. Otherwise, we're doing all sorts of crazy crap. But when we actually know this is what you're expected to do, these are the laws of the land, this is what's good, this is what's bad, all that sort of jazz. Once we know all of that, then we're less likely to turn into lunatics. It allows us to be able to shape the individual's identity and role in society as well. So then they identify as a member of the group, an important member of the group that brings them and makes them feel like they have some sort of purpose. But it is important as well for individuals to be able to achieve a sense of identity that's greater than the group at large. Rituals and symbols also serve to do this. So rituals are the means of reenacting some of the foundational stories of culture, if you will. Some of the religious things like confirmation or communion or bar mitzvahs. Symbols, on the other hand, are more shorthand representations of complex concepts and narratives. So once again, you have a symbol, you've got a ritual, and what they're trying to do is reinforce this notion as a sort of a shorthand that allows us to be able to really integrate with these way of thinking so that as we grow up, we build maps of meaning that are very similar to others and make us feel part of the group that we're a part of. We respond to the world in one of two ways. Whenever we're learning all this sort of stuff, we either respond to change passively or in a revolutionary mode, as he describes it. So the change either happens to you and you're brought along with it, you're forced into it, or you choose. You choose, instead of refusing the call, for those of you who are a hero journey aficionado, instead of the refusal of the call, you say, no, I'm going to change. I'm going to be a revolution. Revolution. What's that song with Bob Marley? Is it Revolution, baby? I can't think of that song. What's worse than singing a song and ruining a podcast is trying to sing a song that you don't know the words to or the tune of. You just have one word in the song. So I'm just going to keep going. He also introduces the concept of divine son. And this is where he gets into a lot of mythology. So hold on to your hat, because we're going to get into some of the archetypes in a little bit. But the divine son is someone who acknowledges outgrown traditions and grapples with the great mother, another archetype we're going to dive into soon, for inspiration. The hero, as he calls it, symbolizes self-awareness and self-consciousness. It's a self-conscious human that braves the unknown while aware of the threat. And he really dives into that on the next few chapters. Again, just in terms of overall, interesting, totally buy into the notion that we, through culture, through education, through socialization, we definitely develop a lot of shared maps of meaning. And in many ways, we are looking at the world, and in order to make the unknown in the world known to us, what's come before us, the traditions, the cultures, the norms, the values of our parents, of the senior people in our community, nowadays of people on YouTube, or nowadays of people online, we are being influenced to think in a particular way. And so I definitely think he is articulating something that is very legitimate at the moment. The challenge is that when we do adhere to this a little bit too tightly, and he mentions this as well, when we buy in too much to what we've been socialized to believe, then we can become quite dogmatic, and then we can form a sort of a ideology, and that can put us into a precarious position. So far, good stuff. There is, chapter 4, what we call the appearance of an anomaly. And this is a challenge to the shared map. Now, an anomaly is kind of like Robert McKee, one of my mentors and a genius in storytelling. He's a screenwriting guru. And Bob says that most stories have at the beginning of them a time where the hero or protagonist, their life is knocked out of balance. And this is what is known as the inciting incident. And anomaly is, as Peterson describes it, is not a million miles away from this notion of the inciting incident. And basically, Peterson describes what happens when new information or new experiences challenges our existing belief system. So we've been enculturized, we've been socialized, we're now believing this is the way the world works according to what we've learned from our society, from the echo chambers we've lived in, from all that sort of jazz. And all of a sudden an anomaly takes place. So for example, with Peterson becoming a socialist, he's in university, everything's good. He's like, yeah, we're down with things, down with things, down with things. And all of a sudden, he starts to realize that he reads this book, the Whig and Peer book by Orwell. He has a few other experiences where he doesn't like the direction in which some of the socialists are going. As a result of that, this anomaly immediately catapults him. I like to use that word catapult. I used it earlier. Did you notice it? Catapults him out of this socialist mind frame, and he now starts to see things differently. He starts to look at the world in a totally different way. This is his experience of anomaly. Or when he went away from religion, and now he's back kind of, but when he went initially away from religion, it was the fact that he wasn't getting sufficient answers. His brain was logically developing, and he wasn't getting the answers he wanted to. Therefore, this anomaly, which made him doubt and challenged his perspective of Christianity, this is the very thing that catapulted him out of that particular way of thinking. So he talks about concepts like the strange, stranger, and the strange idea. So strange is when something new is in our world. Stranger is the new person that enters our space, our worldview. And this is then a strange idea, which is a new idea, which ends up oftentimes being this anomaly. The anomalies are these strange ideas that immediately start us on the journey, the hero's journey, if you will, where we start to look at what are all the things that we don't know yet. Peterson uses the metaphor of the monster to describe anomalies, where heroes confront chaotic or unknown forces. So these encounters aren't just physical, but they're also symbolic. They represent the confrontation with new ideas that disrupt the status quo. And so the response to these anomalies can vary greatly. So whenever you believe something, you're convinced of something, and this is very relevant to the kind of work that I work on. Let's say you've got a conviction, an absolute certain belief about the way the world works, and all of a sudden something comes along that counters that challenges you on that. How do you react to that? Well, some people will just deny it, and they will use what we call confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is this idea in psychology whereby we look for evidence to prove our conclusions are true, and we dismiss evidence that contradicts them. So you believe this is the way the world works. You believe that everyone who believes in religion is X, not the actual... Okay, I had that coming. Everyone who believes in religion is Y. Okay, you just can't mention the formerly known as... Okay, so everyone who believes in religion is Y, right? So you have this blanket statement. And then all of a sudden you come across a counterexample of someone who appears that isn't Y and is religious. So now all of a sudden you're dealing with an anomaly. That's hard to say. Anomaly. And this anomaly, this anomaly. Imagine this whole episode is just me saying, this anomaly is something that you initially will deny, potentially, because confirmation bias. You're looking for evidence to prove your conclusions are true. So even if this religious person seems to be one way, well, they're really not. And we try to dismiss that because we don't want to believe it. We want to maintain the convictions that we have. We want to be consistent with our prior beliefs. And so one way to react to it is deny it, repress it. Right? Or we can go the other way and we can be curious and we can explore it. And we can say, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's possible. And so Peterson says that the health of an individual or society can be measured in its capacity to respond constructively to anomalies. So your ability to be able to listen to something that doesn't fit in your model and to be able to adapt and open your model up is absolutely critical. One of the main reasons why ideologies by their very nature are so bad is because they position us from one point of view or one perspective, and we're locked into that perspective, and everything that doesn't fit into that perspective is immediately dismissed. And so he says a flexible belief system can incorporate new information and adapt accordingly, whereas a rigid system may break under the pressure of change. So it's important for us to be able to overcome that. Change is necessary for evolution. We need to be able to change, but once again, you don't want to change too much. Tradition needs to be renegotiated as opposed to thrown out. So we need to find the balance between chaos and order. Order is the way things always were. Chaos is the crazy change that occurs. And this sort of balance is really something that we need to continuously do, that we're always looking to improve on. So just to give you a quote that sort of summarizes a lot of the ideas in this one. First is unexplored territory, the Great Mother. This is, again, when he brings in the archetypes, the Great Mother. Nature, creative and destructive, source and final resting place of all determinate things. Second is explored territory or known territory. The Great Father, culture, protective and tyrannical, cumulative, ancestral wisdom. Third is the process that mediates between unexplored and explored territory, the Divine Son. The archetype individuals, creative, exploratory word, and vengeful adversary. We are adapted to this world of divine characters much as the object world. So let me explain this and let me break it down. He's basically saying that you have three archetypes. You got the Great Father, the Great Mother, and the Divine Son. Now, the Great Father stands for consistency, the known world, certainty, all that sort of jazz. The Great Mother is chaos, change, madness, creation, destruction. And then you get the Divine Son, who's like, hey, parents, chill. I love both of you. And then the social services say, who do you want to live with? The Great Father, Great Mother. And the Divine Son's like, hey, I want to live with both. I want to respect the order, but I also want a bit of change. I want to renegotiate, and I want my parents to get on well. Therein lies the summary of Maps of Meaning. Anyway, we'll continue on. Chapter 5 is the Hostile Brothers, archetypes of response to the unknown. He dives into a few Bible stories here, which are pretty fascinating if you're interested in that. He says every hero is an evil twin. This is sort of the duality of things. So evil lurks within every human, so we must be vigilant. And this is, once again, born in the knowledge that he knew when he talked to prison dude. Like he started to think to himself, you know what? I'm capable of violent things. Now, if you ask me, am I capable of violent things? The answer is yes. And the reason I know that is because whenever I create, I make films sometimes and, won a few awards, not to mention them. But I just did. So that's obviously not very humble bragging. It's just blatant bragging, but very small festivals. Now I'm bringing in the humility, you see. But a lot of my films, my short films, are quite dark. And they've quite evil characters. The characters that I'm best at playing are psychopaths. So I see that as, and Jung would call this the shadow. Peterson sort of looks at that dark side. Star Wars, perfect. The dark side of the Force, the light side of the Force. I mean, this is all saying the same thing. And Star Wars was influenced by Joseph Campbell, who was the other dude, which was all about myths. And so the story of Star Wars is one of the myths, the great myths that has existed through history, right? So all of this comes down to say, the Hostile Brothers, you got two twins, you got the goodie and you got the baddie. And this resides in each of us. But in order for us to be able to truly understand it, we need to recognize this. So the concept of archetypes really looks at the Hostile Brothers. He says there's two ways to responding to the unknown that we've talked about: exploration and mapping. Like Luke Skywalker says, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to find. Well, actually, his spoiler alert, his uncle and aunt were tortured and murdered by stormtroopers. So that's kind of what forced him to go. But if that didn't happen, he probably still would have decided to go after initially refusing the call. But he went on the adventure. That's Luke Skywalker. That's through exploration and mapping. The hero's journey is what he went on. And that's what we all do. Whenever we face an anomaly where something shakes our worldview, the question is, are we going to be curious? Are we going to explore the new world? Or are we going to retreat back? And that's the withdrawal of the other side. That's the dark side, the adversary that tries to maintain status quo, tries to keep things the way it is. And so these two twin responses inside of us, so we have to make the decision. If you just go for change all the time, you just explore all the time, that's problematic. And if you just withdraw all the time, that's problematic. So we need to be able to recognize that in order for us to become, inverted commas, the divine son or daughter, I don't want to make this, I deserve that. I deserve that buzzing. Yeah, for sure. If you want to become divine, I'm going to be very careful here. If you want to become divine, you need to be able to balance out both. You need to be able to explore, but also you need to be able to respect the tradition. So in chapter 6, we get into the divine son, the hero as word and savior. And so this is someone who is able to go out into the world like a hero, renegotiates the tradition, so is able to renegotiate the tradition, but they're able to articulate, experience the unknown, articulate it, and reshape the collective maps of meaning. In other words, to make this even more practical, this is the person who faces an anomaly and goes out there and then comes back to the world and shares, let's say, with their community, this is the wisdom or the insights that I gained on the hero's journey. So they go out into the great unknown, the hunter-gatherer goes into the great unknown and comes back with insights that can then help the rest of the tribe to be able to survive. So for example, the hunter-gatherer goes out, has a fight with a lion, I don't know, finds a really cool way to kill a lion, which I'm against, by the way. I think lions are wonderful creatures. But back in the day, it was okay to kill lions because, I don't know, because they needed to. So, and the lion probably attacked first. You never know. Anyway, they go out, they figure out the best way to kill the lion. They come back, they tell everyone, hey, I figured out the best way to kill the lion. And as a result of that, now the society has a way to be able to kill lions. And before you know it, there are a lot less hunter-gatherers getting eaten by lions. And you know, if you've heard any of my podcast episodes, I talk a lot about lions eating hunter-gatherers for some unspoken reason. Anyway, the hero confronts the chaos and anomaly, but also articulates it, is able to communicate, is able to describe it, thereby transforming the unknown into the known. And this is really what we do. We educate, we share messages, we share ideas. So there's a lot to be said for this. It's about this journey of the hero's journey isn't just about physically overcoming the monster. It's about the insights we gain along the journey and how we bring those insights back to others, how we share the wisdom that we've gained. As a result of that, the collective wisdom expands and we learn more as a result. The hero's journey itself is something that provides us with these insights and provides us with the opportunity to change. In chapter 7, we get into the Great Father. This is the symbolic representation of judgmental order. This is the Great Father is the archetype that represents the known, order, structure, societal institutions, traditions, laws. It's a stabilizing force, but also a potential source of tyranny. If it is at its best, it's tradition, it's stability, it makes you feel secure, you're happy, you're safe, everything is good. But at its worst, it is fascist state, it is extremist communist state. When there people like Stalin are involved, that is sort of the extremist state. And sometimes even in terms of the capitalist world, it can also be something that can be quite a source of tyranny as well. You don't want to have too much of a rigid adherence to the structures of rules. This sort of authoritarianism will come in as a result. So then we get into chapter 8, with the first of 2 chapters on the Great Mother. And this is where Peterson talks about nature is beautiful and terrible. So he gives the example of how we talk about Mother Nature, right? And the notion of Mother Nature is being, we always say, oh, get out into nature, mindfulness, walk in nature. It's so peaceful and stuff like that. And it's right, but he makes a good point. It's also pretty violent. There's a lot of violent crap that goes on, right? If you've ever seen, some of the documentaries of what's his name, the legend himself, what's the legend's name? The guy who does all the documentaries. What's his name, Mike?
Ken Burns?
No. Ken Burns. Did you hear him? Ken Burns. Yeah, I'm not talking about the crazy documentaries. I'm talking about the nature documentaries, where it's like, David Attenborough. Ken Burns. Oh my goodness, that's ridiculous. Anyway, the point is that if you watch any of those, you'll see there's a lot of violence in nature. Nature's full of violence. If you've ever seen Planet of the Apes, okay, that was not a documentary. But the point is, there's a lot of violence in nature. And yet, nature's so peaceful. But there's violence, but there's peace. The point is that the Great Mother is both. And this is the notion of the fact that the Great Mother symbolizes nature, fertility, creation, and destruction. It's a maternal figure. There's life-giving aspects, but there's also the unpredictability and the potential for devastation. It symbolizes the unknown and the unconscious. And it's this notion of creativity and transformation is really made happen by the Great Mother and the influence of the Great Mother. So this is the chaos that we're talking about. In the next chapter, chapter 9, part 2 of the Great Mother, he talks about representations of the unknown and how the unknown is the source of new possibilities as well as threats, the matrix from which all things emerge and to which they return. And when the divine son interacts and experiences and goes out and experiences this chaos of the Great Mother, the individual's transformed, gaining new knowledge, new strength, and new wisdom. This Great Mother challenges the hero to venture beyond the safety of the known world, which is the Great Father, confront chaos, and return to the boon of new insights that can rejuvenate society. So it's like you got a father, and the father's like, son, just chill. Do not do anything. This is the way we do it. We don't do anything different. You're going to live in the way I tell you to live, okay? And then you say, sure. And then you got the mother, and she's like, hey, Owen, divine son, come on, let's do this. And so you go out, and she goes, okay. And she says, come on, let me bring you on an adventure. And she brings you on this crazy adventure where you learn all sorts of things. And then you come back and you've got all this knowledge and wisdom that you bring home and you try to educate your father with that. I mean, yeah, I can't really relate to this, but I get it. It's known, unknown. You need to balance of both. Once again, very deep ways of saying what could be argued are relatively simple ideas or concepts, but a lot of depth to them, no doubt. In the conclusion then, he talks about the role of the individual is really that you need to continuously process confronting the unknown or chaos and integrating into the realm of the known, which is order. So the whole point of this, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, is you want to experience chaos and you want to make it more known, so you want to learn. I mean, it's the principle of learning. You learn what you don't know, so you start to know it. The individual who's successfully navigated the hero's journey has this knowledge that can update the collective maps of meaning. So you're not only transforming yourself, you're also transforming society, and that's why this is so important for the world. He said this allows us to have the integration of chaos and order, because you're not just confronting the unknown, you're actually bringing back these insights and articulating them, as well as taking action on them. The embodiment of these insights through action ensure that you're making a difference to society. And a quote that he has is, every explorer is therefore by necessity a revolutionary, and every successful revolutionary is a peacemaker. And that's an interesting one. That's an interesting one because in his Oscar-winning speech, the first Irish-born best actor in the Oscars of all time is Cillian Murphy for his incredible role in Oppenheimer. And I'm a huge fan of Cillian, and I think he's phenomenal. He's wonderful. He played Thomas Shelby in Peaky Blinders. By order of the Peaky Blinders. That's a terrible accent, God. And of all the accents I have, that has to be one of the worst ones. But it's such a cool character. I mean, Tommy Shelby is a legend. Anyway, in it, this notion of, nothing to do with Peaky Blinders, in his acceptance speech, Cillian said, I dedicate this to all the peacemakers everywhere. And in many ways, when Peterson says every successful revolutionary is a peacemaker, it's because they've explored the chaos of the world and they've come back with insights and wisdom that hopefully can help us move towards peace, probably because they've learned to be able to open themselves up to the chaos of change. And the more comfortable we are with change, the more likely we are to be able to bring about peace. So I think that is very, very deep, and I really like that idea. Summarized in terms of ideas, it's almost like you start in a stable state where everything's cool, then there's an anomaly that disrupts the state, then the state plunges into chaos, you descend into the unknown underworld as it could be, and then there's the regeneration of stability. In many ways, this is just the hero's journey, right? Everything's good, then all of a sudden you call to action, you refuse the call, then an inciting incident breaks up your life, makes things hard, like the anomaly. Then you have a series of difficult challenges along the way, which you've got to keep, progressive complications, as they're called by Robert McKee, and then you keep pushing against them, learning different things, mentor helps you out, whatever. And then finally you're able to overcome, get out of the underworld, and everything works. That's pretty much the majority of the hero's journey. You need to balance the current security now, the father, with flexibility to change, the mother, when needed. So it's the balance of those two that allows you to be as effective as possible. The quotes, I just want to finish off with quotes and then give you a little critique of it as well. I'm going to be very careful with the critique because I know some of you are big fans of Peterson's work and some of you really want me to say nasty things. So I'm going to hopefully satisfy both of you or neither of you. You'll have to wait to find out. Either way, let's look at some of the quotes. Life without law remains chaotic, effectively intolerable. Life that is pure law becomes sterile, equally unbearable. The domination of chaos or sterility equally breeds murderous resentment and hatred. In a nutshell, don't try to live fully in chaos. Don't try to be too attached to order. You need the balance. Chaos, order, yin yang, as they say. Another quote. Anyway, the fervent hope of every undisciplined person, even an undisciplined genius, is that his current worthlessness and stupidity is someone else's fault. If in the best of cases it's society's fault, then society can be made to pay. This sleight of hand maneuver transforms the undisciplined into the admirable rebel, at least in his own eyes, and allows him to seek unjustified revenge in the disguise of the revolutionary hero. A more absurd parody of heroic behavior could hardly be imagined. Now, I love this quote, and I want to be careful with it as well. One of the things that Peterson will be critiqued for is the notion of personal responsibility that is etched through a lot of his work. And what he seems to be suggesting is, look, you need to take responsibility for your life and you need to stop blaming society. And in many ways, when he says, if it is society's fault, then society can be made to pay, the sleight of hand maneuver transformed the undisciplined into an admirable rebel. Now, what he's sort of suggesting here is that in many ways, when we discuss why we're not the way we want to be, why we're not who we are, this is the victim mindset. And in a nutshell, he's saying the victim mindset is a really bad way to go. And I do fully agree with that. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that there are societal, systemic, and environmental and circumstantial events that do influence and do impact the success that you can have. So I think that I always try to encourage people I work with to embody the notion of a hero. And the way I think of a hero is a hero might start off as a victim, but once they recognize what's happening to them, they start to make it happen for them, and they look for ways of what can they influence, what can they control, what can they take responsibility over. It's important to recognize that some people's circumstances are more difficult than others. And that's something that I think is important to say. I agree with the notion of the need to overcome victimization. I think we do live in a world where far too many people are allowing themselves to be the victims of everything else because, quite frankly, it is easier to do that. But I don't want to dismiss the fact that some people are more victimized than others. And I think it's important that we recognize that and don't just like immediately assume, well, bucko, as Peterson would say, you just need to pick yourself off the floor. I don't think it's quite that simple. But at the same time, once again, I think there's a lot in what he has to say. Another one, inconveniences. He talks about inconveniences and catastrophes. This is another very good one. Inconveniences interfere with the integrity of our plans, so we tend to pretend that they're not there. Catastrophes, by contrast, interfere with the integrity of our whole stories and massively dysregulate our emotions. By their nature, they're harder to ignore, although that does not stop us from trying to do so. Inconveniences are common. Unfortunately, so are catastrophes, self-induced and otherwise. We're adapted to catastrophes like inconveniences as constant environmental features. We can resolve catastrophe just as we can cope with inconvenience, although at a higher cost. As a consequence of this adaptation, this capacity for resolution, catastrophe can rejuvenate, it can also destroy. The more ignored inconvenience in any given catastrophe, the more likely it will destroy. So in a nutshell, you got inconveniences, which are things that piss us off a bit, and then catastrophes, which are things that ruin our life or throw our life completely out of balance. And the idea is that catastrophes can actually be the very thing that helps us to change. When you've got a lot of different inconveniences, that can oftentimes be the thing that ruins your life than the catastrophe. Because the catastrophe is one thing, a big thing, that can define you or inspire you or drive you. It's like Jim Rohn talking about the day of the feeling of disgust when you get to the point where, like, as he says in one of his great stories, I mean, how low can you go? Lying to a Girl Scout. Google Jim Rohn, Girl Scout story. Phenomenal, legend. Anyway, the point is that when you experience that kind of like, that is often the thing that will catapult, I'm bringing it back, I'm bringing the word back, catapult you into a different future. And dealing with that big crisis sometimes is easier than the small little inconveniences that can, when they all stack up, can actually ruin our life. So it's important that we recognize the small things and we nip them in the bud, shall we say. I think that's a very, very important one. So let's finish with going into some of the criticisms that Peterson's got, and I will give you the ones that I agree with and the ones that I disagree with, so I can successfully piss everybody off equally. First of all, too complex. This book, too complex. Totally agree. Very complex. At the same time, though, it is an academic book, but he likes big words. I mean, he's very articulate. The guy is really, really articulate. We should not demonize him for the fact that he likes big words. The struggle for me is this. I believe a lot of the ideas that we went through today, a lot of the concepts that we went through today there's some really useful things there. There's some useful ways of thinking, very interesting, very fascinating. I would love him to make it more accessible. I would love it to be easier to read. And for me, that particular complaint or criticism is certainly warranted. And I don't think it's just on Maps of Meaning. I think his other books, as we'll talk about, I think a lot of times the way he answers questions, he's a very sophisticated debater. He's very skilled. He really knows how to communicate well. He uses a lot of like incendiary language. He's very powerful and, you would argue, charismatic type communicator. And I think he's a lot of great messages. The problem is, a lot of times it's just so many big words there. And you might argue, you might say, well, Owen, just because you're a dummy doesn't mean that you should be attacking him for his big words. And I disagree. So there you go. Another argument on Peterson critique is that he goes to the other extreme and separates human behavior from. So this is the notion of, he says that it's all personal responsibility and emphasizes that too much, like the quote that we mentioned earlier. He sort of ignores global injustice and whatnot. I get it. I understand it. And like I said, it's a little complicated. From my perspective, I believe that it is important for us to focus more on responsibilities. And I think sometimes it is too easy for people to fall into the victimhood. I worked as a therapist for many years. And one of the biggest problems a lot of people have is that they see the world through this victim lens. And as a result of that, they don't have any ability to make a difference to it. When you recognize that you don't always have to be a victim, then it gives you the opportunity to make a change. So from that perspective, I would say that I wouldn't necessarily agree with the criticism too fully, while I acknowledge that, of course, some people really are victimized, that we need to recognize that and try to make a difference in society for that as well. Another argument is he's too Jungian. I mean, that's his stuff, that's his shtick. He likes Jung and he likes the collective conscious. He likes the archetypes. He likes all that sort of stuff. Go figure, fine, every person should have their due. Let them away with it. I don't see that as a criticism, nor do I see broad generalizations, broad assumptions. Most people make them. I mean, not everyone is like being very rigid and very specific in all the examples they have. And then even science, the brain stuff I kind of mentioned, there's a lot of sort of tentative examples there. But once again, brain science is so complicated. Is him simplifying in a way that serves his point while not going too far away from general assumptions we have? I don't see it as a problem. Sometimes that does delete, distort, and generalize information, as Dr. Richard Bandler would say. But the final criticism is something I do agree with, and this is ideological. I'm going to talk more about this next week, but one of the things that Peterson talks about is the problem with ideology and how buying into an ideology, like, for example, socialism, he defines a lot of people with this label of being postmodernist neo-Marxists. And this is a sort of a blanket term he uses to immediately dismiss a lot of people when they're being too politically correct or they're very woke or whatnot, in his perspective. But in many ways, this notion of saying ideology's bad, I agree with him. I think it's a very good point. And then I see the way in which he communicates. And the way in which he communicates quite a lot is quite ideological. He does come from that ideological perspective a lot. Now, he'll defend it and say, no, I'm saying the truth. And I don't disagree that he is speaking the truth as the truth is for him. But when it comes to ideology, his perspectives are so solid and he really is on our side. I mean, if you look at the Twitter, just give me like 1 second to say this. Can you, please? Okay. I'll just turn off the buzzer just for 20 seconds. I promise I won't go in. Okay, great. On Twitter, in social media in general, he tends to be very strong-worded, very angry, very like all this sort of stuff. And if you compare, Maps of Meaning or even the other two books, and you compare it to the stuff he's saying in terms of these short-form mediums, it's like the difference between playing chess and power slap. I see him, in my opinion at least, fall prey to this particular habit. So I think ideologically, this is something that is a potential challenge. So there you have it. I'm sure that any of you who've gotten to the end of this episode, if you've managed to get to the episode, good for you. And maybe you disagree with everything that I've said. Maybe you agree with everything that I've said. Maybe you disagree and agree with some of the stuff that I've said. Maybe you haven't really listened. It's just been playing in the background and you're suddenly coming to going, oh, what was that episode about? But regardless of what your experience was, I hope you learned a little bit more about what Jordan Peterson covered in Maps of Meaning. I hope you have a little bit more familiarity with his work so that when you hear his name, whatever side that they're arguing, you can at least understand a little bit about the psychology in terms of his work. It's a interesting book. If you're into mythology and psychology and philosophy and all that sort of jazz, then it's probably worth giving it a go. It's kind of enjoyable enough reading from that perspective, but it is heavy and it does require quite a lot of effort to get through. Nonetheless, I hope I've given you a brief summary of this book, and I look forward to continuing part 2, where we're going to be looking at the 12 Rules for Life and Beyond Order, 2 of the more recent books of Jordan B. Peterson, where I'll dive into the 24 rules and explain once again what we can learn and how we can use them moving forward. Please do subscribe to the podcast. Download it, share it, tell as many people about it, rate and review it only if you like it. Don't rate and review it if you don't like it. Why would you waste that? And remember, as you go out into chaos and the unknown and you bring back the lessons and learnings into your own way of thinking and into your collective sphere, I hope that you find yourself continuously improving your life. And I hope that the Changing Minds podcast continues to help you to do that. So may you go out into the world and may you embrace the world. And may you continue to believe better. And may the force, as always, be with you. I'm Owen Fitzpatrick. Thank you very much for being here. Bye for now.